I'd like to welcome you to this edition of EMU Today TV. My name is Mark Lee, and I'm so pleased to be back with you remotely, of course. And we're living in very unusual times. And we're going to give you an update on what's going on at EMU. And I'm so pleased to welcome back to this edition of EMU Today TV, President Jim Smith. President Smith, thank you for joining me again.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me. And you are right. We are certainly living in unprecedented times.
Yes, we are. And since the last time we chatted, which was in the latter part of summer, a lot of things have happened at the university. Provide us with an update in terms of how the semester is going. I know it started, I believe, a little bit later in September. Here we are now in November. Provide us with an update in terms of how the semester is going so far.
Be my pleasure, Mark. As most of viewers will know, we did a 3-week pause from what would have been a traditional move-in to a gradual move-in with online instruction totally for those first 3 weeks of class. And I think that set the stage for the semester. Students saw us as walking into the semester very carefully, and we have done exactly that. We've walked into that semester as carefully as we can. About 11% of our courses are in person. So by hybrid or by asynchronous or asynchronous design, we have about 89% of our classes. We do have students still in residence halls, less number, more of them in singles than we've ever had. And I think the outcome, I know you've seen the university dashboard, the outcome has been very favorable. Walter Kraft sent me a little note last week, and I marked it down for today's TV show. Diligence, expertise, and collaboration equal positive results. Walter was playing with a little catchphrase, and I think that's very, very appropriate. We've been diligent. We've used faculty and staff expertise, and we've had positive results. Much credit goes to our faculty, to our students, to our staff that really have rallied around, face masks and being socially and physically distant, following the signs that are all over campus. I was in my office today, and there's an arrow that tells me exactly where to walk to get into my office. So all of those things, using our red cap system with permission to come to campus, a red or green dot telling people you can or can't come to campus, and the check-in stations all have worked really well for us.
Yeah, and as we talk about the results so far, which have been very positive, we'll come back to that in a second. What has the overall response of the students been in terms of how they feel about going to campus when they do have a hybrid class on campus, for example? What has the overall response been to the students in terms of this transition this fall semester?
I met with the student government leadership last week, middle to late last week, and the president, vice president of student government have said that students have taken all of this to heart, that they realize that this is the new normal. They may not like it. I have to tell you, I don't like it. I prefer to be with Mark Lee in a studio with our staff and doing this as we normally do. But we know that's not safe and it's not smart. And I'm in an age demographic that wouldn't be at all smart to be in large groups. And we certainly don't want to make other people ill either. So our students have really taken it to heart. They'd love to be in person. They would love to be able to do more activities at the student center, for example. But we're just going to have to wait for that to come forward.
Excuse me, and I can relate to what you're saying as with other instructors, I'm certainly teaching remotely as well. And I just had this conversation with the students last week in October. And I said, how are you doing? And they were quite candid. They were very honest. They said, we appreciate the university taking the steps that they've taken to protect us as students. And yes, they do miss the social interaction. They miss those opportunities to engage with professors and instructors. But I think in the long haul here, they understand exactly what the university is doing to maintain the level of success that we've had to date thus far.
I agree. And I think our faculty have done the same that are teaching in person. The laboratories that are open, we're much more careful about the distance between student A and student B, the hand washing, physical distancing, face masks, of course. All of that it's a combination effort. the faculty, it's the students, it's the staff that work with us to really bring that about.
But yet, here we are in November. We know the weather's turning. It's going to be getting colder. And I think we all have a sense of uneasiness and anxiety with people now coming indoors and certainly doing things more so indoors. You've expressed concerns in a recent email across the university community. Why don't you share your concerns and how we're going to deal with that?
Well, I don't know that I have the answer for it, but I'll tell you my concerns as I articulated them, Mark, is that Halloween is a social activity. If you know an 18 to 23-year-old, they still like to do things at Halloween. We were at a band concert on Friday, outdoors, physically distanced, but our band members wanted to dress up in Halloween outfits because for them, that's a lot of fun. I worry about those students being indoors and doing those things. I also was worried about and continue to worry about the migration inside. Many of us have eaten out as we dine. I haven't been inside a restaurant since March, but I have eaten out on the terrace or eaten out on the deck at certain restaurants. It's getting too cold for that. So I worry about those people coming back in, even with number restrictions. I worry about it. And then I was a little worried about the Michigan State game that I articulated in our Thursday message of last week, just because the history of that is a big crowd all getting together to watch a big event. And we know we can't have big crowds watching big events right now. It just doesn't make health sense.
Yeah. And as we think about the balance of this semester before we go into the winter semester, graduations are around the corner. Obviously we're in November now, and December you have the the fall graduation. Any thoughts at this point in terms of potential graduation for the graduates for the fall semester?
I knew that question was coming forward. I was prepared for it, Mark. Yes, we know we'll be virtual.
Okay.
You've been in the Convocation Center for graduation. It's packed, person to person, seat to seat. And first, it wouldn't be mentally right. As we think about it, it just doesn't make good sense. But it's also not health conscious. And frankly, the Washtenaw County public health folks wouldn't let us do it.
Yeah.
And they would be right to not let us do it. So we'll do a virtual. We'll have opportunities for people to be photoed in certain ways with caps and gowns. And I've even thrown out the idea I would give a little commencement speech and we would do that online. We'll see if we work through that. But we're hoping for a vaccine. We're hoping for a back-to-back April. As you know, we do a morning and an afternoon in April. We'd love to do that in person, but right now we just can't.
On a personal note, my daughter graduated with a master's degree this past summer, and it was a virtual graduation. And I think at first it was a challenge for her to go through the program, not the program, but the graduation. But I got to tell you, President Smith, when she went through it, she was so pleased, because my comment to her was, you still get that sheepskin. You're still going to put that on the wall. And she still found the job. So my point is at first, I think she was surprised and was a little bit, shocked, a little bit disheartened. But then when she went through the program, she was so thankful and was just as proud as a graduate. And as a father, I was just as proud to see her walk virtually. And it was a wonderful experience for her.
Absolutely. And I think that's the focus we need to have right now, Mark, is that it may be different. It may be, as our students are calling it, the new normal, but the new normal won't be forever. We'll get past this. We'll get back to being able to do in-person commencements and the like. One thing that we haven't talked about, just a quick aside here, is our faculty who have gone outside to do painting. You've probably seen that in one of our EMU Todays where a faculty member said, look, we're going to do outside art painting because we're doing landscape work. Why don't we go outside? We've seen that with music faculty. The band is practiced outdoors for obvious reasons. They can separate and get a lot of space. So again, kudos to everyone who's thinking up new and different ways to do that which has to be done.
And let's come back to the winter semester. We know that students are beginning to register for the winter. There was a recent announcement that the university has now pushed back the start of the winter semester, I believe, into January 13th. Talk about that.
Well, the same logic that prevailed in starting off the school year is prevailing now as we continue on into the winter semester. New Year's Eve is even more worrisome to a president than is Halloween. And you have a young daughter that just graduated, you know that age group. It's hard to tell them to do a virtual New Year's Eve. So we wanted to give some time to see if there's a viral spread. We also wanted to give all of us some time as we're with our families to make sure that our transmission is documented and we can understand how we feel and how things may be playing out. So we did move a bit in time. And then we also did away with the winter break, which I know for some students, I've gotten several emails saying, you know, what about a mental health break? We're working on that. We may have some days that are just defined as mental health break days. But you think about a winter break, you're going to go somewhere and congregate. And right now is not the time to do that. And that's what we're trying to express as we schedule.
So let's make it crystal clear. I know we have a couple of minutes remaining, 2 or 3 minutes remaining, but 2.5 minutes. I want to make it crystal clear so those of you viewing understand the winter semester has been pushed back 1 week to January 13th. Winter break has been eliminated. So let's make sure that we're crystal clear. There'll be no confusion. The university will be sending out communications accordingly to make sure everyone is properly engaged and up to speed on what's going on. Lastly, real quick, in terms of the numbers that we're experiencing relative to other universities, it appears that and across the state of Michigan, Eastern Michigan is doing fairly well in terms of the number of cases being reported.
Well, we've done massive testing, and testing is not the only answer. If you think of a multi-layered approach, which is really what we've discussed all along, and I should say that here at this point too, Mark, I know we're going to run out of time, but communication has been one of our greatest keys.
It has been.
By putting out, you'll remember as an adjunct faculty that we had daily memos for the first 3 or 4 weeks of the pandemic. Then we went to 2 or 3 days a week. Now we're doing about every Thursday with some email blasts in between. But it's very important to get that information to everyone as a communication tool so they understand what we're examining, we're looking at, what we're carrying forward with.
Well, let me say in closing, in our remaining minute or so together, I'm impressed by the communications that you've been sending out across the entire university community. That's why we're doing this program, is to keep everyone engaged. And President Smith, I know that you've been working extremely hard, and we wish you much continued success in terms of leading the university through this unusual times. Thank you very much for your time. We really do appreciate it as well.
Thank you, Mark. It takes a great team to make all this work, and we have assembled a really great team working on this. And I know the next topic's wastewater, and not everyone's going to think that's terribly exciting, but it really is an exciting element of how we've kept people safe on campus. So I know you'll enjoy the discussion with Professor Gellasch, who knows this as well as anyone.
And what we're going to do is, before we have Professor Gellasch on, we're going to again show you a video that talks about the points of pride at EMU. We'll be right back after this brief break. Stay tuned.
Thank you.
Welcome back to EMU Today TV. I hope you had a chance to enjoy that video. Points of pride at EMU. Of course, we can use some good news these days during these unprecedented times. And EMU has a lot of things to be certainly feel good about, and I hope you get a good feelings from the video. All right, what we're going to do is to transition over and to have a great conversation about something that Eastern Michigan University is doing in a very innovative way to really help us track the COVID-19 coronavirus and use some data to help, hopefully to help the healthcare workers and response teams for students on campus. And I'm so pleased to welcome to EMU Today TV, Professor Chris Gellasch, and he's the Associate Professor of Hydrogeology. Chris, thanks for joining us. How you doing?
Oh, doing great. Thanks for having me.
So good to have you. And you know, you could probably do a much better job of explaining exactly. We're going to be recapping this segment as it relates to COVID-19. So why don't you give us a very brief overview before we walk through some slides that you brought with us?
Yes. So what we're doing at EMU is actually testing wastewater for the virus that causes COVID-19. And this is a great way to provide some surveillance without having to actually test every student every day, kind of get an idea of what's going on campus.
Yeah. And so what I'm going to do is to turn over to you. I know you have, again, a few slides that you'd like to share with the audience to kind of walk through how you're tracking it and how the data will be used. I'll turn over to you.
Okay, let me share my screen. All right. So I'll just give you a little quick PowerPoint here. I can get that to work. All right. So what we're doing is in order to sample the wastewater, we're actually sampling, what's coming through the sewer, and that is because the virus that causes COVID-19 actually gets excreted in somebody's stool, in their fecal matter, and that can even happen even before they become symptomatic or would become positive on a human test. So we've contracted out with a company called Aquasite. They're based out of Troy. They come out twice a week, and they do sampling. And the way the samplers work is that we're pulling a little bit of the wastewater every 15 minutes over a 24-hour period. And then it all goes into one big sample, and then it gets tested. And then we actually get to look at how much of the coronavirus we have in there. So here's just a couple of pictures. Here's the sampler. So there's actually a little pump built in here and a control unit. And then I'll show you what the inside looks like. It goes down into the sewer. This is right outside of Buell Hall. So then they kind of looking down into the sewer, see what's going on. And then if you open up that sampler, there's a 10-liter sample container in here. They pack ice packs around it to keep it cold so that you preserve the viruses. Like I said, over 24 hours, they take a composite sample where it's all the wastewater mixed together. They put it all together, they hang it down in the manhole, right? So we're looking down into a manhole, it's anchored in there. And then it's about 8 feet down to the actual sewer line. So then they run these lines you can see here on the right-hand side from the sampler down into the waste stream. And then you can see there's little inlet ports and there's some screen around that will actually keep things like toilet paper from clogging it up. So once we have this all set up, we take our samples, and we're sampling from 11 locations on campus. We're focusing on student housing because the students are living on campus. They're there 24/7. So that's our highest risk group we're worried about. The academic buildings and some other places, they're not as occupied as often and not as many people in there. So the access points we're using are manholes, right? So we got to find a manhole, put it in there. That kind of restricts where we can sample because not every building has a manhole that will isolate just one spot. But we are looking at the residence halls and the apartment complex. So Westview Apartments and Cornell Court, looking there. Brown, we're looking at as well. And then, of course, all the other dorms. So sampling most locations, a few places we're not. We can't get an individual sample from Downing, Best, and Brown.
And so these locations, you're clearly where students are staying, but it also may help. It may help the university identify the high-risk areas.
Yes, and that's what we're trying to do. So we're looking at individual buildings in some cases where we can't monitor an individual building like Phelps Cellars, Walton Putnam. Those are going to be one sample, but that'll tell us if we find high levels of coronavirus, then that tells us that there's someone shedding the virus from that location. So like I said, in some cases we get one building, other cases we get multiple buildings, but still that allows us to figure out what's going on with the population living in that particular building. So once we have that data, where we collect all the wastewater sample, AquaSite takes it to their lab, which is located at Oakland University. They go through and do that. And then what we really want to do is we want to look for not only the data, because it doesn't tell us exactly how many people are infected, but we get kind of a general sense. So we want to see if there's going to be, what's a trend over time, if there's kind of a large spike. If we see a large spike, then we know something's going on. There are likely students that were positive. Then we can go to that building, we can sample and do human testing on all those residents and try to find out who is positive. And this is just an example here on this graph where you see some low levels. The green line, which might be hard to see, that's the bare minimum they could detect. So these are kind of close to the minimum levels. There might be one person in there, although it could be, there's some other factors that could relate to it. But then we see here in the middle, we saw a spike much, much higher, many times higher. Goes from less than 100,000 viruses per liter to almost 600,000. So once we see that, we meet twice a week. There's a work group. So we have folks from housing, the dean of students, public health, dining, lots of other people get in there from the administration. And then we start talking. And in this case, they had already identified some students living in this housing unit that were positive. They were in the process of moving them into our isolation rooms that are over in Buell Hall. And then the next sample, we still saw a little bit of a spike, found out through some more testing, there was one more student that hadn't gotten caught the first time, got them moved out, and then the virus levels stayed pretty low after that. Now, kind of looking at these, it's kind of hard to get an idea of what this actually means in terms of, what is high? How high is going to be high where we have to worry about it? Well, one example is, this is kind of the data for all the sites. And this really tall one here, this is Buell. Buell is where we know that's all of our isolation and quarantine rooms are. So in this case, there were, I think, between 5 and 10 students that either tested positive or were in quarantine because they were suspected to be positive. So this is what 5 to 10 positives would look like. In this case, they're all in isolation, so that's fine. So even this case was pretty low. So if we were to see an outbreak, 10, 20, 100 people were positive in a building, it would be much, much higher than this. So these low numbers are just kind of in here, and they're pretty low. So even if there was one person in there, we're going to go through and prioritize it, but that's going to be a lower priority than if you see one of these spikes. And that's because we want to use this kind of Swiss cheese model where this testing gets used with lots of other data, and then also our distancing and wearing masks and everything else, to try to have these multiple barriers to preventing. So even if you had one positive person in an area, if everybody's wearing masks, everybody's socially distanced, everybody is washing their hands, doing everything else, the risk of transmission is going to be pretty low, right? So the main advantage of this is it's unobtrusive, right? We don't have to bother the students, we don't have to make them line up and take testing all the time, right? We're just sampling the wastewater. We just look for those trends, but we also have to use this with other data, right? So we're talking to other folks, seeing what's going on with some other trends, right? Every time you come to campus, you have to do your COVID pass. So we're getting information from that. So it's really kind of a key component to really doing all of that. And then based on all of these data, then we're figuring out where the priorities to test on campus. And that's mostly, the different housing units, we can prioritize that.
Now, let's bring you back up on the screen here, and we'll continue the conversation briefly. So this is very innovative, and this is the first I've ever heard of it. A multi-layered approach, obviously, to attract the virus and in potential high-risk areas. Is Eastern the only university doing something like this, or other universities across the country, across the state, doing something similar?
Well, that's a good question. We're not the only university doing this, but there was actually a NPR story a couple of days ago I was listening to on my drive into campus, and there's only about 65 colleges all across the United States that are doing this. And I actually was contacted yesterday by someone at another university, and they are considering doing the same type of wastewater sampling that we're doing, and they want more information. So we actually have people reaching out to EMU to find out what are some ways that they can actually enact this type of sampling so that they can better manage their student population.
And so this is currently underway. This is not being planned. This is currently being executed this fall, I'm assuming.
Yes, yeah, we started this in mid-September, and we're sampling twice a week. And as we get more and more data, that gives us a better feel for, what does it look like when we have kind of a baseline versus a potential spike. And that's the key thing now. And as we get into later in the fall, when you hear, all across the country and in the state, where we're seeing more and more cases, then these wastewater data are going to be even more important to really show us what's going on, if there's any potential issues where we need to address.
And as we think about the fall and the weather begins to cool down, and we're beginning to experience that right now, I think what's really fascinating to me is how you're able to track, through wastewater, a potential high risk area. Then you can sample or test those students there to make that direct correlation between the wastewater, if you will, and the students who might actually have the COVID-19.
Yes, and like I said, it's actually, we can actually tell if somebody is positive before they even know it, because they could actually go and get tested on that same day, and they might come back negative because they haven't had it long enough, and they might not have any symptoms, but they'll still be shedding it through their stool. And so that's one of the other advantages. Even before any other means of surveillance will even tell them that they've infected, we can find that out.
And as soon as they find out that they're infected through this technique, if you will, how fast has it been to move those students from point A to point B? To move in a couple of minutes that we have remaining together, how fast can we move those students from point A to point B? Using this information.
Yeah, so what we do is we get the results about 2 days after the sampling. So they sample on Tuesday, they pick it up on Wednesday. Usually by Friday, we know that. In that case, we only know that there's an issue in the building. Then what we do is they contact all the students. Then they'll have them all come in and do testing. That might take a couple of days. So there's a few days of lag in there, right? So it could be 4 or 5 days between when we see something in the wastewater and then we actually find out that individual person is positive. But then we get them, they usually get them moved pretty quickly after that. So yeah. Once they know they're positive, like within 24 hours, usually they're getting them in the isolation rooms.
Well, we talked to President Smith earlier in our closing 30 seconds or so together, and we talked about how well Eastern is doing relative to other areas across the state, of the universities potentially. And I'm sure that this is a major part of really helping us keep those numbers down.
Yeah, and I think this is important too, because we're communicating this, telling the students that they need to be doing the right thing. And that's really the big thing, right? If the students are going to giant parties and not doing the right thing, it's going to spread around. And we've seen this at other universities. And the EMU students, and I like to think our students are pretty down to earth and they kind of understand what's at stake here. So they're really doing the right thing.
Well, Professor Chris Gellasch, I want to thank you very much for sharing this innovative technique and approach for, again, continuing to fight COVID-19. Thank you for sharing this information. Good luck with it as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Again, these results help track the spread or the reduction of the virus, facilitate quicker healthcare response. And as always, I want you all to go out and wash your hands, stay socially distant, do the right thing. And we will check you out next month on EMU Today TV, and wear a mask.